One of the principal reasons for creating this interview series was in large part due to my next guest, Alice Allan, whom I met a few years back in a writing class with the Brooklyn poet Josh Megan. Alice is an Australian poet and podcaster, host of the podcast Poetry Says, which is a wonderful, introspective, and inspiring podcast about the creative process of making poetry. The thing I'm most drawn to her and her podcast is this desire to let people in on the creative process. In her case, it's poetry, but I think there's this strong connection between the two mediums in terms of both artistic craft and also the practical challenges of artistic acceptance, artistic fulfillment. And I was just so grateful to sit down and pick her brain. I hope you like this interview as much as I do, and I will see you next time. Bye.
A friend shows an interest in poetry. Poem me, he used to say, as if to poem was to call or fuck or hold. I'd poem him, but nothing ever stuck. Not Eileen Miles or Tennyson or Schuyler. Not Michael's work or Ursula's, not Keats. I wrote a book for him. That didn't stick. I tried the Mary Carr, A Perfect Mess, knowing he would hate it, and he did. This is the most Alice shit I've ever seen. The city feeds on beauty, Mary writes. She doesn't waste her time on education. He's long gone now. I kept the poems, the city.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I love that.
I'm from a little city called Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. It's about 400,000 people. It's a very sedate and predictable place. I don't really know how I got interested in poetry. I just feel like it was always there. And people around me used to tell me when I was younger, oh, Alice, you'll be a writer, you'll be a poet. The problem was I believed them and I made absolutely no moves to make that happen until I was about 27 years old.
What were you went to college, I assume?
I did, yeah.
What was your intent on going to college?
Well, I went to learn Japanese. I majored in Japanese and Mandarin and East Asian religions. So nothing to do with writing poetry at all. I actually skipped the poetry course at my high school, I think because I was a little bit afraid of what would happen if I took that class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, I didn't want to face it.
It's like when you have like a natural ability, you don't want to, in your mind it's perfect. So
yeah,
you don't want to
exactly.
like find out it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to find out that I'm really bad at it. Yeah.
How does one do poetry? Like what was the next steps for you?
Well, I met this girl I did a class on Islam, and I met this girl. She came and sat down next to me, and she introduced herself, and she told me that she wrote some obscene number of words every day. She was a fiction writer. She was like, oh, I just did 2,500 words yesterday or something like that. And I was so incredibly envious of her. I was so angry that there was somebody my age or maybe a bit younger than me who was already doing it. And the shock of that got me to actually sit down and try to write a few drafts. I had a weird experience where at first, because I aimed really low in terms of where I sent stuff, I got like quite a few acceptances quite quickly and ended up with an inflated sense of how good I was. And once I finally moved to Melbourne and started submitting to journals that were, a bit more established and meant a bit more, I started getting rejected. And that has continued to this day.
I want to talk about the rejection part, but you have this great book. How did that come to be?
Well, it certainly wasn't fast. I think I started writing at about 27, and I think that only came together when I was about 37. I had heard from another poet that you want to have about 20 solid acceptances before you start thinking about doing a manuscript.
Interesting.
I started putting together a manuscript, what I thought of as a manuscript, maybe 3 years before I actually did the empty show, and I sent it out to prizes and things like that. And, you know, they were terrible. They were terrible efforts, just like a mess of drafts that were kind of half there and the few things that I'd had accepted. And what I ended up doing was I paid to go to a residency in the Blue Mountains, which is just outside of Sydney. And it was this amazing place, very quiet, and it had these amazing magnetic walls where I could stick paper up and like move things around. And I just got all the poems that I had ever written, and I put them up on the wall and just kind of lived with them for a week. And finally pulled together something that was a half decent manuscript, and then sent it off to Rabbit, who are my publisher. And I don't know how many weeks later it was, but Jess Wilkinson wrote back and said, yeah, let's do it. And I couldn't believe it.
That must have been hugely thrilling.
It was, yeah, it's indescribable. It was an indescribable moment, yeah.
How do you think your poetry has evolved?
Well, I stopped trying to be all the poets I couldn't be. I have a beautiful mentor called Bonnie Cassidy, who Jess Wilkinson put me in touch with. This was before I put the manuscript together. And Bonnie is a genius, like an actual living genius. She's amazing. But I can't write like her. And for a long time I was trying to, and I didn't sound like myself. And then I eventually met another poet called Louise Carter, who has always written exactly like herself, as far as I can tell. She's made no excuses, and she's never tried to be anyone that she isn't. And I looked at her and I thought, yeah, okay, why don't I just be me, you know? And I think that's still a process that is unfolding. I still feel very unsure about the way that I'm writing and whether it's okay, but faking it seems a lot worse.
How was that process of like sort of giving up that I can't, how did you get there?
I think it was because some of the poems I wrote essentially in other people's voices got accepted for publication, and now they sit out there in the world as these representatives of, again, me faking it, me being somebody who I'm really not, and they don't mean anything to me. And you know, they probably don't mean anything to many other people either. Who knows?
Yeah, gosh. That whole business of like, I don't know, finding yourself. I don't know. Do you have any tips? How does one find their voice?
I think it's more just shedding the stuff that doesn't actually matter. And honestly, I think it's like getting older helps a lot, because when I was under 30 or even under 35, there was a sense that I needed to achieve certain things by a certain time. And then I didn't. And then I realized that it didn't matter, and that nobody was really that interested in whether I did or not. And there was a huge freedom in that. I mean, it sounds maybe disappointing, but yeah, I don't know. I don't sit around worrying whether I'm as good as Keats.
And now I know there's this interest in form for you. I've heard people say, you've probably like, you know, these cliche kind of things about form, but in your investigation of formal poetry, what has it done for your poetry?
Yeah. It is hard to talk about this without going straight to the cliches, isn't it? It's like, oh, there's creativity and constraint. And, taught me to slow down. But those things are true. What has it done? Yeah, I mean, slowing down is probably the main thing. And I think just in a really practical sense, it's got me to focus on the line as a unit. I think a lot of my poems up until I started working with Josh, I was really very much trying to get away with a lot of moves and doing a lot of things that I hoped people wouldn't notice. But if you are trying to write like a good, Petrarchan sonnet or like a blank verse piece, not that I think I've done that yet, but I have tried, and you cannot kid yourself. You
Right.
cannot kid yourself about whether it's working or not.
Yeah.
You can't just go, oh, that'll do.
Yeah.
Because it just won't.
I've found that there's a real technique to it, where maybe before I thought lightning has to strike and then you pour your emotions on the page somehow, but no, there's like it's hard to rhyme in a like natural way, you know?
Yeah, it is really hard. I mean, I think that lightning striking and pouring your emotions onto the page is a thing for some poets, but I think those poets write a lot more than I do. I'm thinking about one of my absolute idols back home, Pam Brown, who has written, 25 books or something like that. And what I know about her writing process is that I always compare it to like calligraphy. When I lived in Japan, I learned calligraphy, and I learned that you have to practice over and over again writing the same character. And then one day, when you sit down, you will get it exactly right, and that'll be, that's the poem. And I think for writers like Pam, they just write so much that sometimes they do capture lightning, and it does all happen in one instant, but it's also off the back of mountains of work, and I don't write mountains of work.
Yeah. Hey, what's the difference between chapbook and book of poetry?
Right.
And I think they came out the same year.
They did. It was a really weird thing. So as the Empty Show was being edited and put together, which was relatively slow, I think it took about a year, another publisher called Puncher and Whatman contacted me completely out of the blue and said, we'd like to include you in this year's chapbook series. I still don't know why. I don't know why they contacted me to do that, but they did. And I was very flattered and very happy and sort of started tinkering around, but I didn't know what the deadline was. And about kind of 3 months in, I thought, I better just check when they want this manuscript by. And thank God I did, because they said, yeah, we need it in about 4 months.
Oh, wow.
And so I've got a copy here for you. So this little guy, Blanks, was written.
Oh, this is beautiful.
It's gorgeous, and I'm so proud of it.
Wow.
It was written in 4 months, and for very terrible, very stressful, very depressed months. And I am proud of the Empty Show, and I think that there's a lot to love about it, but I feel like that book is a lot more like me. And there are more poems in there that I feel closer to. It was it was like an urgent kind of distillation of what was going on.
We've talked about this before, and I think I have the same feelings about deadlines as you, but gosh darn it, they really helped me. Like,
Gotta have
you had 4 months for this.
Yeah.
I imagine it was terrifying, but
it was a lot of waking up at 2 a.m. and going to the computer and working on the poems again. I mean, it's short. I think there are only, like 20 poems in there or something like that. Which is about right, I think. I'm so glad that I can say I still really like it. And I do like The Empty Show as well. But yeah, this one feels like my crazy little baby.
I know Josh has, like, every time I've spoken to him or heard him speak, he's always talking about, he'll just say it casually, like, you should memorize lines of poetry. And then it becomes clear that, like, he means a mountain of poetry, because obviously it's impressive. And my thought instantly goes to, like, I don't know if you're familiar with transcribing, but musicians, especially jazz musicians, in order to like learn the language, you learn it orally and learn it on your instrument. Do you memorize lines of poetry? Is that something that is in your thing?
I wish I did.
Yeah.
I do sometimes. Usually if I've got a reading coming up and I want to share somebody else's work, I'll do it for that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, lately I've been memorizing this poem by a guy called John Forbes, which is called Death and Ode.
Oh.
And I was in the
That's a different one.
Different one to the Speed of Pastoral, yeah.
Well, yeah, but you've been working on I forgot the name of the poem actually, but on your podcast, the other poem that you were taking it like...
Oh, the Dido and Aeneas.
Yes.
Yeah. Funnily enough, that one didn't stick. Even though I thought about it every day for a month, it didn't ever like stick in my mind.
Oh, that's interesting.
But yeah, I think a lot about that instruction from Josh as well. And I think he definitely means it in the lightest possible way. Like, this is something you could do.
Of course. Right.
But yeah, thinking about this poem, Death and Ode, and memorizing it over the last couple of weeks, it has been really useful because you realize you can see all the moves all of a sudden. You can see the choices that he's making and how he gets from point to point and line to line. So it's given me a completely different understanding of the poem. Yeah. And yeah, I probably need to do that with 20 other poems or maybe 50.
This is what I want to say, and we don't have to include this if you don't want, but I find it funny you've done this like 180 on John Forbes. Like,
yeah. What a bastard. What an absolute bastard that guy is. Yeah, no, I adore him. He's like the best we've ever had.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. It's undeniable.
I hate it when people say this about things like, oh, you rhyme me, but I do get a bit of John Forbes in your writing. Do you know?
We all sound like Forbes. We all sound like him. And he sounds like O'Hara. So we all sound like O'Hara. It's sort of annoying. And I didn't realize it until I kind of came to him and I read him and I was like, oh, this is a Rosetta Stone of Australian poetry.
Oh, interesting.
We all sound like this guy.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Tell me about the impetus to make a podcast, and how did that come to be?
Well, I usually tell this story in a pat way, and I say I was living in London and I was very lonely and depressed, and I just wanted to do something creative, but that's not entirely it. I think that is a lot of the story, but the reality is that like the thing that was keeping me going at that time was my little rotation of podcasts.
What were those?
That's embarrassing. Okay, let me think. One of them was definitely The Poetry Gods, which is kind of gave up the ghost in about 2017. And then the other one is this show, which I've been listening to since 2012, which is called Roderick on the Line. It is just two guys who've known each other for their whole lives who just talk to each other once a week. And it's incredibly silly and very, it's that thing where they're like kind of like my friends, even though they have no idea who I am, although I have met one of the co-hosts. And I just wanted to do what they were doing. And I loved that weird sort of really intimate but totally one-way connection that I had with them. It's not that I wanted to necessarily replicate that and have people think that way about me, although that has sort of started to happen in a strange way. I just really, really loved the form, and I thought, can I do this?
And that wasn't necessarily poetry. Their podcast wasn't poetry.
No,
yeah,
nothing to do with poetry at all. Yeah, it's changed and shifted a lot. I've been doing it for 7 years now. It's been a long time. It's been too long. But yeah, it's over the years, like I've changed.
Yeah, right.
And I am interested in different things. I have a totally different relationship to poetry. And if the show hadn't changed, then it would be totally dead in the water.
One thing that I really find, I guess, interesting, but the vulnerability that you are able to achieve in the podcast is really great. How do you allow yourself to do that?
Mm. Well, I don't think about it very hard.
But it seems like you do, because then you talk about it later.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, no, it's good. It's good for you to call me on that. When I record, I'm sitting in a windowless room, totally alone, and I never think about the people who might be listening, except for I think I have like an ideal listener in my mind who's like some combination of, the people I feel who are closest to me at the time. So I think about a very kind, open, loving person who's listening. I don't think about people being critical if I can help it. So yeah, it's just it's an act of I guess imagination and denial, something like that.
Yeah. And then you had this ability to get your guests to also go with you on this kind of talking about big things that I wish more people talked about it. Insecurity, and especially in the arts, comparing yourself to others. But you get your guests to talk about this.
Yeah, it's interesting because in my personal life, I have always been described by others as a good listener. And sometimes that's gotten me into trouble because people will open up to me and tell me things, and then afterwards they'll feel really uncomfortable. And they'll feel like I kind of found out more than they were sort of really willing to tell me. It's a skill that probably comes from some weird places, but it is something that I've always had. I am really interested in people, and I'm bored to death by small talk and by stuff that I feel like is not the real thing. I only ever want to talk about God, love, art, and maybe sex. I don't.
Is death in there?
Yeah, we can talk about death too. But I don't want to hear about I don't know, the wonderful time you had at your residency in Italy, and how just posturing bullshit.
I so relate to that.
Yeah. And it's boring to listen to. And I mean, I'm saying all this, but the reality is that a lot of the time I don't succeed in getting my guests to open up, and I do end up with interviews that are sort of 70 to 80% just really pat standard stuff. And I'm getting less and less patient with that, and more cautious of it, and more I feel that I'm getting a higher standard for myself of what will be worth putting out into the world. Because I'm really lucky I have incredibly dedicated listeners who just trust me, and they listen to everything I put out, so I don't want to abuse that trust. The Australian identity, and particularly the artistic identity, is a really complex one. I mean, it is in every country, in every part of history, but where we are now in Australia is we are finally turning around and reckoning with elements of the colonial past that are really uncomfortable. We're making a lot of space for people that, up until genuinely 15 years ago had absolutely no representation in Australian publishing.
Can you speak to that just for a second? What does that mean?
Well, if you look at the best Australian poems from 2012, for example, you're going to see majority male and almost entirely white writers. The winner of the Stella Prize, which is a huge prize for women's writing that includes both fiction and poetry, for 2021, went to a book called Drop Bear by an Indigenous poet called Evelyn Araluen. I think that book is the perfect distillation of what Australia is, what Australian poetry is, I think like no more deserving book could have won that prize. I know when I say that I sound like very bleeding heart and like, you know, aren't I great kind of thing, but like I really love that book. Yeah, and it's a big and slow and uncomfortable turn, and but I'm really glad that we're making it in the awkward way that we are. Yeah, and then also like still holding on to figures like Forbes, and his contemporaries, and that's something that I also really want to do on the show, is to talk to like my elders, and even and especially when those elders include like straight white guys, who are, you know, wonderful and have a huge amount to teach me as well. So yeah.
Well, I don't know if we want to talk about this, but
That means we probably do.
I'm interested that when we kind of briefly talked about it, when you do put work into the world that you later look at and regret, or maybe have difficulty coming to terms with, how do you live with that?
Oh, I mean, like the same way you live with all the mistakes that you make as a person, right? Like you just have to look at it and go, well, I did the best I could at the time. Have some compassion for yourself. And also realize that like it just, you know, people are not sitting around in a circle passing around your old draft being like, look how stupid this is. Like, and I think too, looking at other poets' work all the time and looking at their early work and seeing, okay, so this person wasn't necessarily fully formed at the start. Like I've got this collection at home, the early Robert Frost.
Oh yeah.
It's really bad. There's no really bad poems in there. But he's written some of my favourite poems ever, so...
Well, I like that too, yeah. Do you ever have somebody tell you that this poem that you find cringeworthy resonates with them somehow? Yeah,
it's funny because there's a poem in The Empty Show which in the end I titled Healing the Anxious Avoidant Relationship Pattern, which is such a dumb title. And that's the one that people point to in the book. They're like, oh, I really like that poem. And I'm like, really? Okay. I would not write that poem like that today. But okay. Great.
Just have to live with that.
Yeah, because I'm not in charge of people's responses. So, yeah.
How do you know when a poem is done?
Well, there's a thing, isn't it? Like, I think it's Valerie. It's never finished, only abandoned, or something like that.
Yeah.
I definitely know when it's not done, which is that it keeps shifting. The draft keeps shifting. Every time I look at it, I find something else to tinker with.
Okay.
I had this, I was in a writing group with a poet called Jennifer Compton, and she had this phrase, I think that poem is sitting quietly on the page. And I think that's a good measure.
Like it exists. It's
got a sense of like calm and completeness about it. And I no longer want to go in and like keep tinkering. I mean, I think like with anything, you get in tune with a sense of like satisfaction when enough is enough. But everybody's sense of that is different. I know poets who only ever write first drafts, and that's what they put out into the world. But again, they write a lot of work, so...
Right. Yeah. That's it. Do you find it difficult to live with the standards that you set as success? Do you find that hard to manage or live with?
I mean, I definitely used to. I was... Again, just being younger, being more interested in striving and hitting certain goals, I was really consumed by it, I think, and really quite miserable. I was lucky that Jess took my book, and then I was exceptionally lucky that I got asked to do that chapbook. And I think for now, that feels like kind of good enough. I mean, the Australian context is so different from the American context. If I become successful in Australia, like the most successful poet in Australia, you will never hear about me. You will never hear about me over here. Whereas semi-successful poets in the US, like, we know and talk about and think about their work. So it's a very uneven relationship. And so
that's not fair.
well, I mean, it just is what it is, but it's also just like, I don't feel like, it would be so insane for me to sit around and be like, well, I want to be Keats, or I want to be Joshua Megan, like, I'm not going to ever reach anything like those heights. And so I, possibly sounds a bit like, I don't know what it sounds like, but like I just have to live in the day and try to make the day good.
Yeah, but how do you do that?
Well, it's a constant process, right? Like, you have to kind of think like yesterday we had this horrible flooding here in New York, and my ceiling was leaking, and I was feeling pretty like lonely and sorry for myself. But I was like, okay, so what's the next right thing? Like, and I thought, well, I really want to write something, and so I did. And I sat down and I wrote this essay, which will hopefully become an episode of the show. And that felt good for that day. Like, I really don't wish to come across sounding like I'm some sort of like enlightened being. Like, I worry and I feel sad and I want things all the time, but it's just that it's less than it used to be.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I always come back to Mr. Rogers, who, we think of him as this almost angelic, kind person. Mm-hmm. But he said something once like he struggles with being a good person every day also.
Of course.
Yeah. But it's just so interesting. Like, everybody has the same conversation of.
Yes. Yeah, everybody does. Everybody struggles with that. Everybody feels like they are left out and excluded. I was delighted and a little bit sad to hear that Les Murray, who was, probably the biggest name that we've had in Australian poetry, felt like a total outcast in the scene. Everybody has somebody who they want to impress, and they feel like we'll never hear them. That's the beauty of like doing this kind of work, is like you get to hear the same thing over and over again, and you sort of realize like, oh, we're all just like, we've just got like the same 5 problems. Yeah,
we're all scared 8-year-olds.
Yes, and we just want to be like included in the game. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So back home there's a poet called David Brooks, who is not your David Brooks, very different guy, who wrote a poem called Lovers in Wentworth Park, which is a funny, sexy, sweet poem about taking his dog for a walk and coming across a couple who are having, some amorous times in the park. And it's one of my favourite poems of his. He's one of my favourite poets. And that was a day when I was just walking around Edinburgh Gardens, which is right outside my house, and I sort of noticed the same thing. And so I wrote this poem called Lovers in Edinburgh Gardens, and the epigraph is the first line of David Brooks' poem. There's a couple making love in Wentworth Park. There's a couple making love in Edinburgh Gardens, right on the edge of the dog park. They make me think of Steve, who once turned to me over beers at the Dixon Tradies and sort of sneered, "So what do you believe in?" I bet it's something amorphous, like love. What I never got was the amorphous, like shapeless. Later, to the air above the bed, he said, "You're my favourite person not to have sex with." The feeling was deeply mutual. Steve was proud of his big, declarative statements. Here's mine. I don't need to believe. It's happening in front of my eyes.
Thank you.
That's okay.
What have you learned in doing your podcasts?
Well, it's something I really want to say to you, which is you can get so stuck in a rut. Mm. You can end up just grinding out content. And it really is content, not work at that point, when you're just doing it for the sake of the format of your show. I reached a point where I was so sick of it. It felt so dry and pointless. It was a strange moment where I actually got commissioned to make a bunch of interviews for an organisation in Australia, and they paid me money to do interviews, and it was the worst I'd ever felt about the work I was doing in the show. And after that, there was a confluence of events, one of which was Melbourne went back into its exceptionally strict lockdown rules at the end of 2021. So once again, I was stuck in my house, not allowed to go out after 9 p.m, not allowed to drive more than 5 kilometres from my house, not allowed to go out for more than an hour and only for exercise, that kind of thing. And during that time, I was sending voice messages back and forth with this friend of mine. And I had this brainwave where I was like, I could just make an episode out of these voice messages. And I did that. And this was also the time when I discovered Matthew's show, Slee Ricketts. And honestly, it was one of the things, it was the only bright spot in that period. It was such a horrible, dark time. And, I listened to Matthew's show and I was like, well, this guy's just doing whatever the hell he wants. That sucks. Why am I not doing that?
Oh, that's interesting.
And I think I wrote to him and said, look, you're really getting me to think about what it is that I'm doing. And since then, I've kept trying to steer the show towards what I actually want to do, what I actually want to make. I've not been perfect at it because I've got 6 years of doing it a certain way that I'm trying to push against. But I'm trying to keep it weird and strange and exactly how I want it to be, while still not, while hopefully not alienating my whole audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned money, and I've heard you in your podcast also mention how just money, once it enters the picture, it just sort of sucks, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And how did that kind of corrupt what you were doing?
Well, the people who paid me had a say in who I spoke to, which I didn't like, because I ended up doing interviews with people that I didn't really, I always try to connect with the guest, and I got something out of all those conversations, but they weren't necessarily people I would have chosen to speak to. They wanted the interviews to have a certain flavour, which was less interesting to me. They were more sort of standard, what does poetry mean to you? That kind of thing. Yeah, deep sigh. Yeah, and it was just a really good lesson in if I'm going to take money from somebody, I need to do it with really clear boundaries around what I will and won't do for that money. But yeah, maybe kind of linking back to what I was talking about before, when I was younger, I had this idea in my head that I needed to become somebody who made my living through writing. And when you're a poet, that's an insane goal to have. That's a completely insane goal to have. So I was like, okay, so maybe I'll write magazine articles or something like that. And then I ended up in all these weird jobs. I've had so many jobs. Ended up in all these weird jobs that I thought were kind of close to that, but weren't really at all. And I only got happy and satisfied with the balance when I completely gave up on trying to make the thing that made me money link to what made me artistically happy, and just was I go over here, I make a paycheck, I pretend like I care about all this stuff that I really don't care about, and then I use that as kind of my self-funded sort of grant thing.
Does the people over here, are they aware of the Alice over here?
To varying degrees. But they don't. Yeah, they don't care.
Yeah,
they're just they're just not that interested in me, and I think it's kind of a running joke with myself. So often on the podcast over the last 6 months, I've just been oh, my boss, my job, I hate it so much. And I'm like, God, if people listen to this, they're so
that's
offended.
what I wondered.
But they never will. They just never will listen.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And now I feel like you've got this global connection to poetry podcasters and a poetry community. What's that been like?
It's really bittersweet because, like I said, it's a tyranny of distance. yeah, I feel like my best friends in poetry live like 17 time zones away and 24 hours flying time away. Yeah, but I take solace from the fact that like every relationship in poetry that we talk about, like Bishop and Lowell, I've got a book of letters between Schuyler and O'Hara. I've got Olson and Creeley back at home. Like, they're all correspondence relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have a weird situation in Melbourne where like a lot of the poets are friends and they hang out and they go to each other's houses and they like help each other move and things like that. And that's just not really how it usually is. Usually, if you're friends with poets, you are friends through words. You are not catching up.
Actually, friends. Are you have poetry friends in Melbourne too? Are you? It seems.
Not really.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not really. I mean, I love them all. They're all like really talented people, and I feel really proud to live and work like around them. But I'm not like best mates. Like, I don't catch up for beers with people.
You don't
really
help them move.
I don't help them move. I've been to some birthday parties, which is lovely. It's lovely to be invited to that. But yeah, I mean, my closest poetry friend in Australia would be Louise Carter, and she lives in Sydney, and I see her like maybe once every 18 months. Yeah.
Or maybe the question I want to ask is, when nothing's coming, how do you generate ideas and the white hot heat of emotion when you don't feel like it, when your roof is leaking and
Yeah, I'm so grateful the ceiling didn't fall in. Well, I think there are a lot of answers to that. There are as many answers to that as there are like people who write. I've done things like I will write a poem every day for 100 days. I did that. Probably got 3 or 4 decent poems out of it. I have completely accepted that I have no impetus to write and just thought, okay, well, it'll come when it comes. That also works. Like, I think I know that I said that it was meeting that girl at university who was writing 2,500 words a day that really like lit a fire under me. I think that's important. But, if you're churning out work for the sake of it, it's the same as with making this show, right? And you're not happy with the result, maybe that's not worth it. Although it does remind me of something that I heard Arlene Miles say in Melbourne, that it's so simple, but it was just like, write the poem, then write the next poem, then write the next poem. And I think of a lot of my poems as like poems on the way to the next one. Yeah, I think it's just like approaching yourself with more kindness than you would probably instinctively want to.
Yeah, I don't know.
You're not convinced by that at all.
I don't think you're convinced by that, to be honest. But,
well, I'm very good at like punishing myself and using things as like a stick to beat myself with, but it doesn't make good work. Like, it doesn't make my work better.
What are you working on now? What's new?
Well, I sat down the other day and kind of went through all the drafts that I had floating around, some of which were literally just titles and others were fully formed, like the ones that I sent you, and looked at what I actually had. And I think I have maybe 15 workable poems and maybe 2 really good ones, like, well, good, I don't know. 2 that I'm really excited about.
Killers.
Yeah, 2 killers. I was trying not to say that.
I'll say it.
So I think in reality I have 2 poems. And
yeah, what does that mean?
Well, the Empty Show and Blanks came out on top of each other in 2019-20. It's now 2023. Absolutely no one is sitting around thinking, when's the next Alice Allan collection coming out?
Not true.
There is just no point in rushing something together for the sake of, if I were one of those poets who was like, I'm into it for reputation and standing and I want to build a legacy, then I probably would be quite worried. And I probably would think that like 3 years is a long time. But I don't feel that. All I want is that if I have another book, I feel like it's the best I could possibly do. And I'm nowhere near that at this point.
It's interesting. Some people are not precious about they just release. It just doesn't matter.
Mm. Yeah, just put it out there.
And then finding this balance of, I mean, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you're so, I don't know, picky or unpleased with this. There's this standard that you have to get.
Mm.
How do you find that balance?
If it's going to be in a book or if it's going to be published somewhere, then I want to have been happy with it. At the very least, at the time that I sent it out, I wouldn't rule out that my feelings wouldn't change. I mean, it does get difficult if, again, you believe that it really matters. But I just can't buy into that. I just, for myself, you know, I just can't sit around thinking like, oh my God, this poem's out there that I don't stand behind anymore. Or, oh my God, I wrote this terrible draft and I'm the worst person in the world. Everything I write has to be perfect. Like I can't stay there for very long.
Mm. How do you see your podcast go? Can you even predict where it's headed?
Hopefully not. I think that would be a problem if I could. I do want to be more strategic and choosy about who I speak to. I think there's probably an argument for my slowing down. I've been doing it every week.
Yeah, you do once a week.
Yeah.
Really impressive.
Yeah, and that's only been true since about 2021.
Mm.
This is the first really long break I've taken being here. I am really just trying to take it a day at a time with that and just go, okay, well, when I get home, I'll see how I feel, what I want to do with it. But it has to be something that makes me happy. The thing about recording your voice is it's almost impossible to fake how you feel. Like,
oh, interesting.
Yeah. You know, if I were writing blog posts or like essays every week, I could be totally miserable with that work and the audience would never know.
Mm-hmm.
But I have people sometimes contacting me and saying like, are you okay? And you know, like I'm not okay, but like not to do with the show necessarily, but to do with like other stuff.
Oh, that's really sweet.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's so nice that people care. Yeah.
Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to talk about that we haven't?
Like the one thing that I would underscore that I probably haven't really spoken to is like I don't do anything that I do artistically in isolation. I rely really heavily on my connections with other artists, and I wouldn't make the show if it wasn't for my connection with Matthew and with other people who've supported me in making it. I wouldn't write the way that I do if it weren't for my connection with Lou and the support and direction of Bonnie. I understand this is like, I'm hearing myself and I'm like, this is like a very female like way to like sum up. Is like, it's not me, it's everybody else. Everyone else is helping me. But like, it's true. It's true. That's how I see it anyway.
I know I mentioned this to you, but it rings in my brain often. Your summation of why you make the podcast is to connect with others and to keep learning. And I just thought that was that was perfect. And the connection with others is so important, especially now when it seems like we're connecting, but in reality, we're somehow like giving fake versions of ourselves and not really connecting.
Yeah, which is another thing to be cautious of. I do think of the person who you hear on Poetry Says as a bit of a version of myself.
Oh, right.
But she's not so far away from the reality. She's just a bit more articulate and has planned a bit what she's going to say, you know. A lot of the connections around this stuff are flimsy and sort of passing things. And that's something about doing it for 7 years. It's like the people who were with me at the start are just absolutely nowhere to be found now. But there are some connections, people like Lou, and, you know, I hope people like Matthew as well, that like it feels like a very real thing. So I don't know.
Do you keep in touch with the comedy scene at all?
Not anymore.
I
No,
really...
that was a dark time in my life.
It was?
Yeah.
I can't picture it, but I'm fascinated that...
No, that was like a full-on midlife crisis. So that was like 3 years of like totally trying to be a different person. Yeah. I mean, I love comedy. Like, I so respect what stand-ups do, and I was doing improvisation, and like it was super fun, but I went super crazy.
Were you... my impression was you were doing like improv comedy, not stand-up, but were you doing also stand-up?
No, I never did stand-up. I did one set that was like, we had this show where it was like, you do 5 minutes of prompts on a projector. So it's like, it's stand-up, but it's improvised.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, I did that one time. That was horrendous.
I mean, yeah, that's hard.
And I did a couple of sketches as well, which was fun. Like, I did a very weird sketch where I was Marie Kondo, but I was also the woman from The Ring. And I did, I like cut my stomach open, like
organized it?
Yeah, I organized all that. And then I did another one where I was like the spirit of Me Too, and I had like all these men's names like on my body. I was nuts. I was totally crazy.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to Alice and her time and her words of wisdom. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Please like, subscribe, reach out, say hi. I hope this finds you well wherever you are. I'll see you next time. Bye.